The United States Congress passes a major piece of legislation that will have a huge impact for Americans. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. President Trump has won a major legislative victory on Capitol Hill. What he calls his big, beautiful bill has been approved after winning narrow majorities in both the House of Representatives and the U.S. Senate. The mega bill calls for tax cuts and increased spending for security and defense. President Trump touted his achievement at a rally in Iowa on Thursday night.
There could be no better birthday present for America than the phenomenal victory we achieved just hours ago when Congress passed the one big, beautiful bill to make America great again.
But the controversial legislation will also see cuts to some vital social programs, and it faced strong opposition from Democrats in Congress.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today in strong opposition to Donald Trump's one big, ugly bill. This disgusting abomination, the GOP tax scam, that guts Medicaid, rips food from the mouths of children, seniors, and veterans, and rewards billionaires with massive tax breaks.
For more details, we begin with this report from CGTN's Tony Waterman.
There's no denying that this is a major victory for President Trump and for Republicans, nearly all of them falling in line behind the president's agenda. There were only two that voted against this bill, and those holdouts, along with all of the Democrats, raised some very serious concerns about the trillions of dollars this bill will add to the national debt, and also the slashing of very crucial safety nets for America's poorest. The nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office says that 17 million people will lose their health coverage or health subsidies over the next decade, that 3 million people are going to be kicked off of food assistance. And those cuts, which total into the trillions of dollars, are meant to offset tax cuts for high-income households, also this temporary freezing of taxes on overtime and tips, and adding hundreds of billions of dollars in fresh funding for Trump's immigration policy. The Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, though, saying that this is exactly what voters mandated of them last November.
Why did you think that was possible? Because I would sum it up with one word. It's belief. Okay, we had a vision for what we wanted to do as a group. We believed in the election cycle last fall that we were going to be given this great blessing of unified government, that we would have the White House and the Senate and the House aligned, an alignment, unified government. And we did not want to waste that opportunity because we understand the history that comes along with it, the opportunity that we can do for the country.
Polling shows that this bill is deeply unpopular with Americans, the vast majority of whom, including Republicans, do not want to see the national deficit added to, do not want to see these massive slashes to America's safety nets. And for Democrats who were greatly disappointed in this voting that took place on Thursday, for them, they believe the silver lining is that this bill could come back to haunt Republicans in the midterm elections.
I know that there are people concerned with what's happening in America, but understand what our journey teaches us is that after Project 2025 comes Project 2026. And you will have an opportunity to end this national nightmare.
But while Democrats believe that this will be a winning issue for them in the midterms, the way this bill is structured might prove otherwise. What we may have are people showing up to the voting booth with much more money in their pocket because of these tax cuts, but not yet having felt the repercussions from those slashes to those benefit programs. Tony Waterman, CGTN, Washington.
And for reaction now, I'm joined by Eleanor Clift. She is a political columnist for the Daily Beast. Also joining us is Adolfo Franco. He's an attorney and Republican strategist. Welcome to both of you. Eleanor, let me start with you. Some of the biggest criticisms of the bill is that it will increase costs for millions of people enrolled in the public health insurance program called Medicaid. Out-of-pocket costs will also rise, and the Congressional Budget Office estimates 270,000 people will be kicked off the food assistance program. There will also be more money for deportation of undocumented migrants. Repayment of student loans becomes more expensive as well. What is your broad assessment of this bill?
Well, I've been in Washington a long time. I came here covering Jimmy Carter. That was 1976. I have never witnessed a president of either party wanting to lower the number of people with health insurance. Every president has come in, Republican, Democrat, wanting to expand the number of people, with the goal being universal health coverage. This bill deliberately raises costs, puts a lot of bureaucratic red tape in place, deliberately to exclude people from having health care insurance. And then the cutbacks are premised on an attitude that many of the people that access social welfare are somehow, not working hard enough or not working at all, and that there's a great deal of fraud. There is fraud in the Medicaid and Medicare system, but it's generally by providers and people trying to scam the system. It's not from individuals. So there is an element of I want to say cruelty in this bill that we have never seen before, and it adds $4 trillion to the debt. And I've watched, again, politicians over the years say debt is really serious, it's going to cripple our grandchildren, and then Dick Cheney, former vice president, said, the debt really doesn't matter. And Ronald Reagan famously said the debt is big enough to take care of itself. Well, it's now so big that people who earlier might have dismissed worries about adding more debt are now worried that we could be reaching a tipping point. So the shorthand for this bill is that it rewards people at the top end of the income bracket at the expense of people who have been taking part in the social welfare safety net. Okay. So it's an unusual combination.
All right, Adolfo, what is your response to all of that? No doubt you're going to have a very different view, but first I want us to listen to a bit more of what President Trump had to say at that rally in Iowa.
Deport the illegals and slash hundreds of billions of dollars of waste and fraud, and that's what we're doing. With this bill, every major promise I made to the people of Iowa in 2024 became a promise kept.
So, Adolfo, that is President Trump's view, but what is your response to what Eleanor just told us?
Well, I'm going to respond to Eleanor, but then I also want to talk about all the positives this bill does, because I think it's important. It's been lost, particularly by the so-called mainstream media, of the wonderful things the bill is going to do to stimulate growth in our economy. But first, I have a great deal of respect for Eleanor Clift. I came in the Reagan administration, so a little bit later. So I've been here a long time, and I came, of course, when the famous Reagan tax cuts were made in 1982. So this bill is very similar to that Reagan-era success that led to prosperity. But let me address the so-called cuts and the cruelty issues. The cruelty, of course, would have been, had this bill not been enacted, the very successful 2017 tax cuts that President Trump put through would have expired, and every single American, including those people Eleanor is concerned about, every single American would have had a tax increase next year. Now that's what I call cruelty. Now the bill provides for the average medium American will save through this bill over $10,000 a year on expanded deductions. Since we're concerned about children and so forth, the child credit deduction has been increased. The exemption for single and joint filers for the exemption in taxes goes up. 90% of taxpayers use that, so that's enormously important. So what it does to answer those questions on the so-called cruelty part is the following. I want to address this. Nothing is being cut. What is being done here are work requirements for able-bodied people. And the work requirements are quite light compared to those Americans who work full-time. And they can be exempted, they can even be voluntary. So we want able-bodied people not to scam the system. Yeah. And if they're needy, if they're needy, they'll be eligible for Medicaid. Yeah. But if they're not, they need to work. That's not an enormous, that's what the Democrats are focused on. The other thing is they're focused on so-called cuts. Yeah. This has to do with a more complicated subject, which has to do with the Medicare expansion state levels. And those things are just gimmicks. But let me just say this. In 2017, the Congressional Budget Office said that Trump tax cuts were going to produce over $2 trillion in deficit. And it was quite the opposite, because this bill, and we need to talk about the positives, which you have not touched on, this bill actually is going to stimulate and grow the economy, and those projections on the deficit will not come to pass, in addition to the fact that the bill cuts, for the first time in American history, $1.2 trillion in spending.
All right, let me ask Eleanor about that. Eleanor, supporters of this bill do say that these tax cuts will stimulate investment, will expand the economy, will make Americans more prosperous. What is your response to that? And also to Adolfo's point that nothing is being cut.
We've heard that before. Supply side economics is what it was called. It didn't work. The Reagan tax cuts dug a big hole in the Treasury that they spent his second term trying to fill unsuccessfully. Susan Collins, Maine Republican, offered an amendment to just not extend the tax cuts on the top 1% or 10% of the population, and that would have helped fix a lot of this bill when it comes to adding more debt. They could extend the tax cuts for the lower and middle classes, just eliminate them for the very topmost people. She offered an amendment for that, and it failed, of course. And you know, it just the rationale for this bill working is that there are all these people sitting on couches who are not going out and taking all these jobs that are available. I want to say, show me the evidence. Let's see, let's shine a light on who these people are, because I don't think they exist. It's a little bit like Ronald Reagan's welfare queen. You draw this caricature and people imagine the worst, and maybe you'll find one or two or a handful, but this is by no means the dominant population that is relying on Medicaid and food assistance. There are a lot of them are children.
What's that based on? That's just
the burden.
That's just
one moment, Adolfo. I'll get to you in a moment. Yeah.
Will be revealed over time.
Right.
And you know, so we'll see. Okay. We'll see who's right and who isn't.
Okay, Adolfo, go ahead.
Well, we've already seen it. 2017. These were the same tax cuts that are now going to be extended, and there are other sweeteners to grow the economy, which I'll get to in a moment. We have to talk about all the positives. The Congressional Budget Office was dead wrong, and that gets no reporting in 2017. And the reason that Donald Trump was reelected is because we saw the last 4 years of disastrous economic policies, while his economic program worked very, very well for his 4 years. Now, this is an opinion. I have a lot of respect for Eleanor, but that's just an opinion that she thinks people aren't on the couch or otherwise.
Okay, Adolfo, there's also...
The Inspector General's reviews of these programs are fraught with lack of controls and fraud and abuse. Now, again, this is about work requirements for able-bodied people. So therefore, the people who really need it, that others are concerned about...
Adolfo, I've got a lot to go through. I just want to get to... one of the
talk about the growth?
Adolfo, I just want to get to one of the comments made by one of the Democrat congresswomen, Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez. She's from New York. She's a strong opponent of this bill. Let's listen to some of what she had to say, and then I'd like your opinion on that.
President Trump, you're either being lied to or you are lying to the American people. Because this bill represents, in the text of this bill, the largest and greatest loss of health care in American history. 17 million Americans will lose their health care on this bill, not undocumented people, not quote unquote the disgusting term illegal, but 17 million Americans.
So, Adolfo, is President Trump looking after the rich at the expense of the poor?
No, well, if that's the poster child for the American people, I'll put her up against President Trump anytime if you want to have that debate. By the way, illegal alien is the term used in the statute. So it's just so disgusting the Congresswoman can try to get that corrected in Congress. But let me tell you what the bill really does. It doesn't take, she's taking the global number. It doesn't throw 17 million people off, and Eleanor knows that, and people knows that. Again, it's a work requirement for able bodies, so the people who really need it can actually access this.
Yeah.
But you need to look at what the bill does for small businesses and for business investment, and for the pass-throughs and a lot of the technical things. We can get into this program if you like, the incentives for business to create investment.
Right.
That's how you grow the economy. And at the end of the day, there's a philosophical difference here. You've seen it with Congresswoman Cortez and, of course, this candidate for mayor of New York. And then our side of it is they believe that the government can solve these problems and grow. And they have grown the deficit.
Okay, Adolfo, we are rapidly running out of time. I want to get to Eleanor. Eleanor, you get the last word. Yeah, go ahead. And we've got just a minute left.
The Congressional Budget Office is a nonpartisan office. Democrats have complained about them in the past. So have Republicans. They're pretty much straight down the middle. The numbers, the projections of people who will lose their health care come from the Congressional Budget Office. They're not made up by Democrats. And it was President Trump who promised he would not touch the health care system, and he has. And for a long time, that's been known as one of the third rails of
the Congressional Budget Office got it wrong in 2017.
We'll see if he pays the price at the midterms next year. That will
see if the Congressional Budget Office.
We have run out of time. I'm going to have to leave it there. Eleanor Clift, Adolfo Franco, thanks to both of you for being with us.
Thank you.
And as we explore the merits and criticisms of this major piece of legislation, let's hear now from Bill Crane. He's a political analyst and principal for CSI Crane. Joining us too is David Super. He is a professor of law and economics at Georgetown University Law Center. Welcome to both of you. Bill, good to see you. President Trump has secured his first major legislative win of his second term, that is. What he calls his big, beautiful bill has passed, but critics say, and this is broadly speaking, critics say it will increase the debt considerably and slash government spending on key social programs like Medicaid and food stamps. What is your view on this bill?
It will burst the budget. It is adding $3.3 trillion over 10 years, according to the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office. The dollar is tanking. It's a holiday here in the United States, but the dollar is tanking in world markets, looking at that kind of debt being added to roughly $30 trillion in existing foreign debt that we owe on deficit spending. And the social service and social safety net cuts are of concern for a lot of Americans, not just those of lower income and not just Democrats. But you also have to look at the fact that we've had this anomaly in America for some time. People want tax cuts, which they're getting, but they don't want spending cuts. So you either have to raise revenues or look at non-discretionary spending. Discretionary spending, which isn't things like social programs and national defense, is only about 22% of the federal government budget. So you could really slash all of that, which would be about $2 trillion, and you still would not be able to balance this budget.
David, good to have you with us on the show as well. Critics say, and again I'm speaking very broadly here, that this bill is good for the rich and bad for the poor. Would you agree with that assessment?
I certainly agree that it's bad for the poor, but ultimately increasing the deficit this much at a time of relative economic prosperity when the economy does not need stimulus is going to cause problems that will affect the whole country. So this is going to be a short-term sugar high for the rich, but in the long term, it's going to do a great deal of damage to everybody.
When you say, David, that it's going to do a great deal of damage, what kind of damage are we talking about?
Very real risk of stagflation, that we will see the Federal Reserve keep interest rates high because of this extraordinarily stimulative fiscal policy, and that will cause an economic slowing. But because of this enormous amount of money getting thrown into the economy, we'll also have a lot more inflation. So we will have slow growth, maybe a recession, and too high inflation. That's not good for anybody.
Bill Crane, this legislation was passed by very narrow majorities in both houses. That's the House of Representatives as well as the United States Senate. Some of the provisions will go into effect pretty soon, but the cuts to social programs that we were talking about only will come into effect after the midterm elections next year. What do you think will be the political impact of this for Republicans once we see what this bill is doing?
We have a midterm election in 2026 in November. Those typically favor the party out of power in the White House, which in this case is the Democratic Party, as a baseline. I compare this to the Affordable Care Act in 2010 when Barack Obama had the White House and both chambers of Congress. It passed the House by 7 votes. It passed the U.S. Senate by 1 vote. It was extremely, I wouldn't say in disfavor, but a lot of people had questions that couldn't get answered until after the legislation was passed. And it was devastating for Barack Obama in those congressional midterms in 2010, where he lost the U.S. House, and it really significantly slowed his agenda for his second term. So you have, in this instance, Donald Trump essentially repeating that, a massive omnibus reconciliation bill, nearly 1,000 pages. A lot of folks don't know what got crammed in there at the end to get some recalcitrant votes, like the state of Alaska, as an example, will not receive the Medicaid cuts or the SNAP food stamp benefit cuts that the other 49 states will, to get the vote of Senator Lisa Murkowski out of the Senate to get it back to the House for its final vote and on to the White House. So we don't know yet what all is in there, but we know it's very expensive. And as you said, though it won't take effect until after these elections, people are aware it's coming. The president also froze spending right after this bill was passed by the House on a number of school programs, particularly after school and school lunches, kind of burying it in another headline going into a holiday weekend. That's going to happen immediately, and that's already causing ramifications among some of his voting base.
David, we also hear that this will add to the national debt, add more than $3 trillion to the national debt. What are the implications of that? Because we hear very often that the national debt doesn't really matter. The United States dollar is a reserve currency, and if the government needs to pay its bills, it'll just print more money.
The public doesn't understand huge numbers like $3 trillion, but they have a general sense of whether things are going in the right direction or the wrong direction. And when there are widespread reports and nonpartisan analyses all saying that this is going to blow up the deficit, the public has a sense that no one's in charge and that people are acting irresponsibly. In that case, it's correct. So I don't think the specific numbers, 3 trillion, 4 trillion, make a lot of difference, but the sense that we've got a huge bit of deficit spending here, despite the fact that we're savaging food assistance and medical coverage for people, is going to make the public dissatisfied.
Bill Crane, if we look at some of the polling, the bill is not popular with most Americans, but there are some things they do agree with them. And if we look at immigration, for instance, the U.S., well, and defense, the U.S. military will get more money. There will be also more money for border security, detention centers, and immigration enforcement. And as I said, there's polling that tells us that these measures that are being undertaken by President Trump are largely popular, widely popular with voters. But you know, how is this money going to be used? Because there's also been criticism of the manner in which these immigration policies have been carried out. I mean, some people have been saying that it's cruel, some of what's being done.
$350 billion in spending related to immigration reform, finishing the border wall with Mexico, which is $150 billion in and of itself, and significantly increasing the number of personnel in immigration, naturalization, customs agents, and border security. Even Republicans who are concerned about secure borders point out that border crossings at the southern border, which were where the bigger problem was, have dropped from roughly 50,000 a month during Joe Biden's presidency, illegal attempts, to less than 5,000. So the problem is not completely solved, but it may not require another $350 billion worth of spending. but that's in the budget. To put $1 trillion in perspective, we are celebrating America's 250th birthday today. From that date in 1776 to Ronald Reagan's presidency, all federal government spending came to $1 trillion. So we're talking about a deficit 3 times that over 10 years of all federal government spending, or about 225 of our 250, or 210 of our 250 years.
David Super, this is being called a mega bill. I mean, it's a lot of pages in this bill. Is this a good way to govern? Because, you know, there also are these small provisions that are tucked away in these mega bills, which are put in there to placate the concerns of individual Congress people who come from, you know, disparate districts around the country. I mean, do we escape, these details that I'm talking about, do they escape scrutiny when we get a bill of this size?
Oh, absolutely. There's not one single member of Congress who read the bill before voting on it. They couldn't have. It was floated at the very, very last minute by Senate Leader Thune and hustled through the House at great speed. So there'll be all sorts of things coming out in the weeks and months to come that members of Congress will say, oh, I didn't know that. It'll be true. They didn't know that, but they did, of course, make the choice to vote without reading it.
Right. Bill Crane, the Congress people, the members from the Senate and the House of Representatives will now have to go back to their constituents to sell this bill. I mean, if we take a state like Georgia, where you are right now, is it going to be a tough sell?
There are popular elements of the bill. There are things in the bill that people wanted, like significant tax cuts. There are incentives for corporations, particularly manufacturers, to hire and expand and to not pay, for example, to be able to write down the cost of a new manufacturing plant in one tax year, which for a corporation would be a major boon, as opposed to having to spread that over 10 or 20 years, allowing them to hire more quickly. So there are things that are going to be popular here in Georgia. We're not a border state, but we're impacted by the border states of Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, Texas, and a lot of immigration into the city of Atlanta, where I'm based. But this will be very hotly partisan divided. The base in the GOP is clearly behind the president. I've never seen really this kind of fealty, if you will, by members of Congress on the Republican side. Even if you go back to the Reagan years, where he was very charismatic and charming and amiable, there wasn't this fear factor that those who are considering voting against the bill had. We had a U.S. senator who's going to seek re-election, Tom Tillis in North Carolina, who was one of the 2 votes in opposition, who's announced he will not seek re-election. And Laura Trump, the first daughter-in-law and wife of Eric Trump and co-chair of the RNC, has acknowledged she's considering for the 2nd time returning to her native state of North Carolina to run for that seat. So there will be a job of selling it. The question, of course, is how quickly will people become aware of the things they don't like?
Right.
There's a measure inside the bill that will extend or lower restrictions on gun silencers. That has no business being in a budget reconciliation bill.
Okay, that's where we have to leave it. Bill Crane, David Super, thanks to both of you for being with us. And thank you for watching another edition of The Heat.
Making sense of the overwhelming wave